5 Card Mastermind. Today, in the next episode of the 5 Card Population Playbook, we're going to be looking at 4 different exploits that we can use to exploit the population on flush boards. So first up, let's take a deep dive into what it means when population triple barrels. Does population have sizing tails? So in theory, when we double barrel on a flush board, when either the flop is monotone or the flush gets in on the turn and there's no pairs on the board, we are supposed to use a full pot sizing or a check back strategy. Now, this is basically because the worst hands that the in-position player will barrel for value are going to be the second nut flush. So we basically use a big sizing to demonstrate this polarity. But as I'm sure that you're gathering by now, population does not play anywhere close to theory. So what I've done here is I've basically broken down into percentages what sizing population likes to use when double barreling their nut flushes. So we can see that players rarely use the small size to barrel their nut flushes, using a 33% or less barrel sizing just 11% of the time when they hold the nut flush. Now, a note that we could make here is that from looking through hands, it seems like the only time people really use this small barrel size with their nut flushes is when they have like the super nuts with top set or top 2 pair along with the nut flush, because they basically block the out of position players' continues and they really want to get value from the weaker parts of their range. What we can see from this graphic is that the most common barrel size for nut flushes on the turn for population is anywhere between 50% pot and 75% pot. And full pot is still used at quite a reasonable frequency, 25% of the time. So what information can we glean from these numbers? Well, essentially, population does not need to bet full pot in order to polarize to strong flushes. So with any sizing over 50% pot, they are basically already polarizing, and therefore out with pot odds, we can treat barrels sized anywhere between half pot and full pot by population as repping the nut flush, or at the very least, the second nut flush. In other words, don't just assume because someone barrels for half pot that they are repping less than the nut flush. Very likely they are either bluffing or have the nut flush themselves. One thing to consider is that even though this is a sample of 2 million hands that we've got this information from, the triple barrel on flush boards with no pairing cards and the hand getting to showdown only happened about 100 times. So it's possible with more instances of this node that the numbers could change. But I think the numbers here are going to be a good rough estimation of how the population plays their nut flushes on the turn. Also, of course, we only know what people have when they get called down and we see what they show up with on the river. So it's not actually easy to get a big enough data sample that we can tell what kind of sizings people use for bluffs on flush boards. So we don't really know if players are sizing differently or the same with their nut flushes compared to their nut flush blockers, for example. What we really want to know to effectively exploit facing triple barrels by population is, are players over bluffing in this line or are they under bluffing in this line? So facing a full pot sizing on the river, we need population to be bluffing 33% of the time to effectively bluff catch here. Well, population are in fact only bluffing 28% of the time in the triple barrel line on flush boards. Intuitively, I actually thought this number was going to be even lower. The reason being that turn bluffing hands in 5 card on flush boards are quite unintuitive, and therefore I expected population to triple barrel with bluffs a bit less often than 28% of the time. We're going to definitely go into how population structures their turn barrel and range with bluffs a little bit later on, but for now, just know that they do under bluff this spot. But given the data, we already know that when facing a triple barrel on a flush board from an unknown member of the 5 card population, we can profitably fold all bluff catchers by the river. So given this data, are there situations where we should in fact bluff catch? I think the answer is probably yes, sometimes. So firstly, when we block villains' flushes with 3 or 4 of the suit, we should definitely consider bluff catching. Blocking their flushes is really, really important in terms of removal to their value range, and so this is the main thing we should consider when bluff catching. So I would say that blocking 4 of a suit, we should basically always bluff catch. We just have such good removal with 4 of a suit that if our opponent ever shows up with bluffs, then it probably becomes a pretty decent call down. When we block 3 of a suit, I think we should be a little bit more selective. So, for example, if we know that our opponent is capable of triple barrel bluffing with blockers, then we definitely want to consider calling a lot of these combos. Or, for example, if we also block their showdown value, so if we have 2 pair with our 3 flush blockers, this is going to make a good bluff catch because we block the hands that they would actually want to check back and show down with, therefore making it a little bit more likely at least that they have some sort of bluff. Okay, now I just want to jump into a couple of hand examples to demonstrate this. So here we are in the small blind, we go for a raise, we get called. Pretty standard check call, I think. And we call the turn. And we end up calling the river as well and get shown the blocker. So I think there's a couple of reasons this hand makes a good call down, even against a seemingly quite passive opponent. So firstly, his range is going to be super wide here. So it's not just going to be restricted to high double suited hands, for example. He's calling a small blind open in the big blind. This is basically going to be the widest defending pre-flop formation for him. Therefore, he should, in theory, have a lot of random single ace of diamonds hands. Doesn't need to be not suited that often. Secondly, we have 3 of a kind, which makes a good bluff catcher. And thirdly, we block his showdown value pretty heavily by the river. So blocking Queen Jack, which is going to check back, blocking some like kings and ace king that's going to check back, it just makes it a little bit more likely that he has a bluff in his hand. So I think this is a really good spot to actually bluff catch. We have one more. Okay, don't want to ruin it. So we have this heads up hand. Playing against a very aggro opponent. He goes for the limp. We check back. We check. He bets full pot. Actually, this is probably just fold, I would imagine. Maybe with a double gutter heads up, it's fine. We can hit a 7 and a 10. It's just not to the nuts, which is not good. But anyway, we call. We check call turn. Don't think we ever want to fold flushes with 3 clubs here. And on the river, he goes for a pot again, and we go for the call, and he shows us the ace high blocker. So I think kind of similar to the other hand, his range is going to be extremely weak when he limps on the button, he only limps 10% of hands and raises like 75% from the button heads up. So generally when this is the case, the hands that they limp are going to be like weak hands that often won't have the nut suit. So I think for these reasons and our 3 clubs, this actually makes a really good call down as well. Okay, secondly, we want to bluff catch a little bit more versus maniacs who we believe are capable of turning made hands into bluffs on the river. So what do I mean by this? So let's say we are playing against a player who bets the flop, we call out of position, then he pots the turn, we again call out of position, and now we get to this river where some of the straights complete. So we check to this player one more time, and in theory, the button here is never supposed to be betting a straight and basically never supposed to be betting a set. So if we think that our opponent is going to turn some of these, for example, 7-8 or pocket nines with a heart into a bluff, which I think is a very real expectation against a lot of players. I might even use pocket nines or 7-8 as a bluff here sometimes. I think it's a reasonable assumption that this player is going to be over bluffing, and therefore we probably do want to call down a little bit wider than theory. So I think a good example of this is this heads up hand. So we see a raise from a button here who's basically opening his entire range. This hand is probably still too weak to call, even versus such a wide range, I would guess. But we do go for the call. We check call flop, pretty standard. Turn, definitely still calling against a very aggressive player, especially when we have the 3-5, so we can bolt up against his nut flushes sometimes. So we call, and he goes for the full pot barrel on the river, and we call, and he shows the ace high blocker. So there's a couple of reasons why I think this is a reasonable call down. Firstly, this is a very aggressive player. He's playing a lot of hands. He's mixing it up pre-flop and post-flop. So for that reason, he's probably going to be leaning on the bluffier side as a general rule. Secondly, there is now 4 diamonds on the board. So in the same way that when we have 3 or 4 of a suit, it's less likely our opponent has a flush. When there's an extra diamond on the board, it's less likely that our opponent has diamonds also. So the reason that I really think this is a good example though, is if we look at what this player is supposed to do on a similar board when he triples, when he bets the flop, pots the turn and gets this river, he's supposed to be checking every single set in his range, and he's also supposed to be checking every top 2 pair and most 2 pairs with top pairs. I think a player like this is definitely capable of turning king queen, king 8, king 5, queen 5 with a diamond into a bluff here, and so I think it's possibly a spot where he might be over bluffing, and therefore we can bluff catch a little bit more effectively. Now lastly, a very interesting observation that I found is that because population constructs their turn barrel bluffing range very, very badly, missing a lot of bets with sets and 2 pairs that they are supposed to always bet in theory, by the time they get to the river and the board pairs, they're actually going to be missing a lot of full houses from their range. So when they bet the flop, barrel the turn, and get to a river and the board pairs, when they pot again, they're actually going to be missing a lot of very strong hands in their range. And so this is perhaps counterintuitively a spot that we can actually bluff catch a lot wider than in theory. So a couple of examples of this phenomena here. So we're against a very aggressive player heads up here. He goes for a raise pre, we call, all standard. We check call flop, bottom two with the second nut flush draw. Turn the second nut flush. He now goes for a 3/4 bet on the turn. We have another standard call with our two pair. And on the river, he goes for a full pot. So what I mean when I say that his turn range is not going to be balanced here is that on the turn, he's supposed to be betting a load of like queen 9, queen 8, queen 9 9 with flush draw, with flush blockers, so that he has enough bolts on the river when the river does pair. But I think most players are just not finding these kind of mergy bluffs on the turn, and therefore his range when he gets to the river doesn't really make sense to it doesn't make sense to use pot a lot because he no longer wants to bet his nut flush, especially for this size. And if we think he's missing a lot of sets and two pairs on the turn, then this is going to be probably over bluffed by this guy here, especially considering his stats and how capable he looks like he is of aggression. So we go for the call, and yes, we do see the blocker bluff. The same kind of thing happens in this hand against another aggressive heads up player. We limp the button, go for the limp call. I think we limp here because this guy's 3-betting loads, so makes sense for us to start limping, especially with hands that are pushed to indifference versus 3-bets like this. So we limp call, he c-bets, we call, we turn flush. Again, with two pair, we're never folding a flush here. And the kind of same thing happens. This guy goes for a 3/4 size bet. But if we know that he's probably not constructing his turn range effectively with like pocket jacks, pocket eights, jack eight, 8-6 with a club blocker, then we can actually bluff catch here a lot more than theory. And I think in general, our hand just makes a really good bluff catcher anyway, given that we have a jack and a 6 along with our flush. So we go for the call, and he does show up with the nut flush blocker. So I think that was probably the most interesting thing I found when researching how to play against triple barrels against population on flush boards. But it totally makes sense the way they construct their range and why we can actually bluff catch a little bit more than theory in this spot specifically. So now that we know how population plays in triple barrel lines on flush boards, how should we play this line ourselves? So my hypothesis is basically in spots where population under bluffs, these are probably really good spots for us ourselves to overbluff. Therefore, if population is under bluffing in triple barrel lines on flush boards, we should probably be over bluffing in this line. So that's our hypothesis, but what does the data actually say? Well, it looks like our assumption is correct. So when the flush arrives on either the flop or the turn, with our triple barrels, we have 57% fold equity on the river, way more than we actually need to bet with our bluffs. And even more interestingly, when we triple barrel and the flush arrives on the river, we have even more fold equity than this with 64%. I actually wonder if you guys can guess why we have so much more fold equity when the flush gets in on the river compared to the flop or the turn. Well, we will jump into this reason in the next couple of slides. So some observations. We now know that population is overfolding to triple barrels on flush boards. What's interesting when we look at the showdowns themselves is that population is calling down way too linear. Basically, this means that they are prioritizing overall hand strength instead of prioritizing blockers like they should. So to demonstrate why this is such a big mistake, let's look at this example. So when facing a triple barrel on this board where the flush gets in on the turn, the solver is only bluff catching 61% of its second nut flushes while holding 2 of the suit. And we can see with this King 973 with 2 hearts in the second nut flush versus a GTO triple barrel range, this hand only makes like 0.15 big blinds by bluff catching the river. So if the in position player is under bluffing even by an inch, this hand is going to become a pretty massive loser in terms of bluff catching. Again, we know that population is under bluffing on these runouts, and so against an unknown player, we should basically always fold this combo by the river. Now, on the other hand, with flushes worse than the second nut flush, if we hold 3 hearts, we never ever fold these combos in theory to the triple barrel. Folding here in theory with an 8 high flush would be losing 17.5 big blinds, which is a pretty massive percentage of the pot. So I hope that this further demonstrates just how important having blockers is when bluff catching on these runouts. But more importantly maybe, population seems to massively overvalue the second nut flush as a bluff catcher. So favouring overall hand strength to the blocker properties of the 3 low hearts. These hands with the 3 low hearts, like this Ace King 8-7 deuce with the 8 high hearts, is going to be a pretty huge mistake in terms of the way the population are playing this spot. A couple of further observations about triple barreling on these flush boards. So population is calling too many sets on the turn, and this basically means that by the river, their range is going to be a bit weaker than it should be in theory. Therefore, we are going to have more fold equity with a triple. Also, population is not slow playing enough nut flushes on the flop. So if we look at almost any monotone unpaired board, when the out of position player checks to the in position player and the in position player bets for 1/3 pot, the out of position player is supposed to be on average slow playing about half of their flop nut flushes by going for the smooth call. I feel like most of population is probably raising their nut flushes at way too high a frequency. And so when they do just go for the check call, I think they're kind of capping themselves, and therefore their range is going to be weaker than it should be on turn and river. And therefore, again, we're going to have more fold equity with a triple barrel line. And lastly, I did ask earlier why we have so much fold equity in the triple barrel line when the flush gets in on the river as opposed to the flop or the turn. And that's basically because population donks way too many nut flushes when they get in on the river. So I think this is kind of because they're scared of missing out on value and the in position player will check back too often, which is possibly true, but it basically again leaves their checking range on the river really weighted towards hands that are going to fold to the triple barrel, and that's probably where this 64% fold frequency is coming from for population. So as you can see, almost everything population is doing is leaving their river range capped. And this is why we want to be so aggressive on flush runouts. We just really want to attack this weak range the population gets to the river with. Okay, so in terms of practicality, how do we exploit this? So let's get into a couple of specifics. Well, of course, we want to increase our bluffing frequency on all flush runouts. More specifically, we want to prioritize the second nut flush blocker when we are triple barrel bluffing, especially when the flush arrives on the river. Because if we expect population to either raise or donk the nut flush way more often than they're supposed to, then we can even assume that the second nut flush blocker is going to be a better bluffing candidate than the nut flush blocker, as we're not going to be blocking their most common bluff catchers, and we will actually have more fold equity. So if we have a look at this example in the trainer here, so button raises pre-flop, big blind calls, button goes bet flop, barrel turn, and we get to this 7 of hearts river, we can see that the out of position player is not supposed to be donking this river a lot at all. It only donks 86% of flushes and only 33 or 40-ish% of nut flushes. I would think that most of population are probably donking closer to like 75 to 85% of nut flushes here. So when they actually do go for the check, I think we want to be a lot more aggressive in the button shoes. So hands I would kind of expand my bluffing range with here for the triple barrel line. As we said, we want to prioritize the king of hearts with no hearts. And let's say we don't want any sets. We can check those back and no straights. We'll see how often this kind of hand class wants to bet. So it does bet this hand class quite a lot. I would probably just bet every single combo that checks here. I think that's probably the easiest way to increase our bluff frequency in this spot. So anytime we have worse than a set and we have the naked king of hearts, blocking population's main linear bluff catches on the river, I think we should just be using all of these hands to go for the triple barrel bluff. So even like queen 8 here, with the king of hearts, I think we should just be potting 100% of the time. I think that's probably the easiest and most simple way to increase our triple barrel frequency here if we know the population is going to overfold this spot. The last exploits I want to go over today are again going to be interconnected. We want to overfold versus turn barrels and also attack river versus turn checks. So why should we overfold versus double barrels on flush and turns? Well, simply put, because population under bluffs flush and turns after it c-bets the flop. So I want to drag up PLO Trainer to demonstrate how much people are probably under bluffing these spots. So button opens, big blind calls, we go for a c-bet in position on Jack 10-6. Deuce of hearts comes in on the turn, it checks to us once again. So if we look at what hands we're actually supposed to be betting here, yes, we're supposed to be betting like most nut flushes, half of our second nut flushes. I would say it's already debatable that population is going to barrel for pot with second nut flushes here. I think most people probably check back too often with this hand class. But what's super interesting is if we look at the sets here, top set is supposed to be betting 65% of the time, 71% of the time if it has a flush blocker. If it has a straight draw, it's still betting half the time, and if it has a straight draw blocker, still betting half the time. Its other combos don't really exist because everything's going to have a flush blocker or a straight draw blocker on this board. But basically, yeah, the top set is going to be betting 65% of the time here. Middle set is going to be betting 30%. Bottom set 23%. Two pair is going to be betting a lot as well, especially our kind of bottom two pair category. It's going to be betting over half the time here. Basically, anytime it has a flush blocker, and even sometimes when it doesn't have a flush blocker. So if we actually just filter for hands that don't have a flush, and don't have the ace of hearts and don't have the king of hearts, we can see that we're still betting like at a 21% frequency in theory here. And I don't think we really need to look too much into MDA to realize that population are definitely not finding enough bluffs in this spot. So if this is not happening, then we can actually already start being extremely tight for second barrels on these runouts. How tight we should be, we can have another look at the trainer. So let's say the button does pot here. We can have a look at what the out of position player is going to do with his flushes. So remember, this is his defending range against an already very aggressive polarized range from the button. So we can see the second nut flush actually starts to fold even against an opponent who's going to be finding enough bluffs. So if we have a look at the second nut flush, so we have the king of hearts with two hearts, no ace of hearts, and let's say we don't have two pair and we don't have a set. I just want to have a look at what the EV of defending on the turn with these types of no blocker king high hearts hands are. And let's say we don't have 3 suits and we don't have 4 suits, so we only have the 2 suit combos. So like, still calling most of these combos, but it's starting to fold some seemingly random king high flushes on the turn. We look at the weakest EV calls here. We can see that it's mixing a lot of these between fold and call. And yeah, we can see that some of these combos are just barely making any EV by bluff catching against this very aggressive button range that the solver has in theory. So if we think that population is under bluffing even by a tiny bit, I would imagine a lot of these calls that make, between 1 and 3 big blinds probably become significantly losing calls on the turn in practice. So I would actually say against population, when we have the second nut flush on the turn and we face a barrel, when we don't have any outs to improve in the form of a set or 2 pair, and we're not holding 3 or 4 of a suit, we can probably safely fold all of our second nut flushes on the turn, as crazy as that seems. So carrying on from this, the second exploit that we can make, now that we know that population is severely under bluffing on these flushing turns, is that we can attack their weak turn checkback range when we get to the river. So what is the hypothesis here? Well, if we again look at how the in-position player is supposed to construct their turn bluffing range in these spots, we can see that hands like sets are supposed to make up a very big portion of their barrels. Also, hands like bottom 2 pair, 2 pair with top pair, and a flush blocker, these are all going to be mergy hands that should be in their turn bluffing range in theory. And the solver basically does this for a couple of reasons. So by potting the turn with these hands, it is actually getting the out of position player to start folding some flushes. By betting top set, it can still get called by weaker sets, so it can get some value from parts of the out of position player's range. And also, most importantly, maybe, it keeps some strong hands in the in position player's range when the river board pairs. So I'm fairly sure, as I said, that population are very rarely finding these bluffs on the turn. And therefore, we can attack this very weak part of their check back range on the turn by betting small on river at a very high frequency when the turn checks through. So we basically get to push loads of the in-position players, two-pair combos and set combos to Indifference on the river. Now, one future exploit that we can actually use to set up this river exploit is when we see a c-bet on the flop from the in-position player on a two-tone board, we can actually float just a little bit wider because we know we're going to get to see more rivers if the in-position player isn't finding all those barrels on the turn. This basically allows us to use this small bet on the river more often and take down the pot against this in-position player's capped range. So that is the hypothesis, but what does the data say? So in theory, after betting flop and checking back a flush completing turn, GTO only folds between 35 and 45% if they face a 1/3 block bet on the river. Population is actually folding 68% of the time in this line, which is pretty insane and gives us a crazy good price, just bluffing basically our entire range for a small size. So in conclusion, population does not find anywhere near enough natural bluffs on flush turns, and therefore we just need to fold these turns at a much higher frequency in practice than we should in theory. Secondly, after c-betting flop and checking back a flush completing turn, population is going to be extremely capped. This means that after we see a check back on the turn, we want to probe the river at a super high frequency for a very small size. Okay guys, that's all I have for you today. I will see you in the next video in the 5-card population playbook series.